Black Brawn, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, hello, welcome to Card Table. I believe last time we were talking about Down and Dirty, Only the Dead Know Jokertown, the opening story by John Joseph Miller, which I raved about. I think it's the best of the Yeoman stories. So, as always, I just sort of hold up one of these covers and then start talking and kind of lose track of just how long I've been holding up the same cover. But this is the Science Sci-Fi Club exclusive hardcover. Following John Joseph Miller's story, we go to some of the serialized stuff, the stuff that's kind of broken up into parts. The Sleeper story by Roger Zelazny and the Turtle story by George R. Martin, the Rosemary and Vagabond thread by Leanne C. Harper. I really like the Turtle one a lot. The Turtle is kind of continues his sort of sad sacchery, the sort of the Peter Parker taken to a sort of pathetic extreme, where he truly is within the Wildcard universe. The great and powerful Turtle is in his identity as this guy inside an armored vehicle, the most powerful telekinetic in the WCU, and sort of beloved by aces and jokers alike. And then in his secret identity, he's a 40-something schlub, kind of real sad sack character. Not really all that likable. I've found I always liked him as a kid. I think because I love the concept so much. I don't think I quite grasped how. And I assume it's intentional. He is kind of a dick, the Tom Tudbury character, because yes, he is a loser and has the idea, particularly in this volume, in volume 5, is we've sort of seen him as a sad sack in volume 2, and then in the third book, I guess we can do spoilers for previous books as we're talking about a new one, but in the third book there's a sort of sequence where it seems as if he's been killed. And then at the end, he sort of shows up alive, but we never, he's not one of the POV characters for Volume 3, so we never actually see that whole episode from Turtle's perspective, both the attempted murder and then how he survived. So via flashbacks in Volume 5, we sort of get filled in on that backstory. And the sort of the thrust of it is that, part of it is that, well, yeah, it's sort of discouraged him in two different ways. In one way, it's sort of made him realize that this shell that he always thought he was entirely safe whenever he was within it is not quite as 100% secure as he always just sort of was assuming, and always was sort of secure in the knowledge that he was kind of entirely armored. So he's become vulnerable in a way that he never realized he was, and sort of has realized that he essentially always was that vulnerable and just maybe didn't realize it. A lot of interesting metaphorical implications there. And then meanwhile, there's a more practical level where even though he did survive the assassination attempt, his shell did not. And in Volume 2, that story, part of the Turtle's adventures in that one and his arc involves his shell in that volume being destroyed. And until Volume 5, it's never really addressed the idea of replacing shells and all that stuff. And so there's a little bit of, even though there's a little bit of Peter Parker, I guess, in this volume, we get a little bit of that kind of Iron Man notion of the Silver Age shell doesn't look the same as the as later shells. But there's sort of like a what in Iron Man, I guess, what do they call it? Like the Mark 1 armor or the Mark 2 armor? Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't really follow Iron Man, but we learned that there was like sort of the Silver Age shell, the Volkswagen Bug that was armored and given armor plate. And then at some point he, at several points, it was between the 60s and the 80s, he's upgraded. And created different shells. And then, as I recall, the way it works out, some people can do this with Iron Man armor, or like there are like X-Men websites that talk about like the different Sentinels that have appeared over the years, like the Mark III Sentinels and the Mark IV Sentinels. As much of an X-Men fan as I am, I can't say that I can do that. But when we're talking turtle shells, I'm right there. First one is the VW bug, and then he creates a second one, he creates a third one, and then as volume 2 of Wild Cards is taking place, so it's March of '86. At that point, the turtle has just upgraded to his fourth and that one gets destroyed over the course of the events of volume 2. March of '86, when Turtle loses shell number 4. September of '86, which is when book 3 takes place, he's got shell number 5 now. So at the beginning of volume 5, he's basically talking about how to the one friend he has who knows his secret identity and has been with him since the beginning, his friend Joey. He's sort of lamenting the fact that he actually is incredibly poor in terms of his civilian identity as Tom Tudbury. He just kind of lives in a kind of, he lives in a junkyard which he bought from his friend Joey, or from his friend Joey's family, and he can keep his shell in sort of an underground sort of pit below all the junk. There's a certain romanticism to it, in a way. There's that sort of kind of superhero thing, of like having your secret area that's more than it seems. So it seems like just a junkyard. Reminds me a little of the Three Investigators, that kind of Hardy Boys knockoff that I used to always like. I guess if I'm being honest, like it more than the Hardy Boys. The three kids who solved mysteries, I think they had kind of a junkyard hideout that was almost like their little bat cave. Oddly enough, somewhere in volume 5, there's a bit about, or is it volume 2? One of those two volumes, there's a bit about how in the world of Wild Cards, there's actually a great and powerful turtle comic book that's produced by Kosh Comics, which is a made-up comic book company within the world of Wild Cards that in itself has, I believe, has there's an inside joke there. George Martin, Mr. Martin himself actually explained it to me what the joke was. He might have blogged about it too. Kosh Comics is like an inside joke. I'll look that up in a future YouTube video. I can tell that fascinating story to anyone who's watching. But so Kosh Comics produces this turtle comic, and in the comic he's like a Bruce Wayne type. This fiction, because no one knows who the turtle really is. So in the fictional comic book turtle, he's there's we don't get too many details, but we get a sense that he's like sort of the Batman of the Kosh Comics universe, where he's got a big cool cave with trophies and stuff, the Turtle Cave, and a butler and all that stuff, which is then contrasted with his real life, where he's actually kind of pathetic. Of course, from the outside, there's even the idea of just having your own like sort of kingdom of junk with your shell underneath that you can go out and fight crimes in. Even that has a certain romantic quality to it, really. But then, of course, some of the dramatic irony comes from the fact that if you're actually living it, it's actually kind of depressing that he kind of lives in squalor in this little shack that's on the junkyard property. Can't afford anything better because even though he's made perfectly good money over the years, he's always sunk it. That's probably his terminology. He sinks the money into improving his shells over the years. So yeah, he kind of laments the fact that he had shell number 4 was really awesome, and then it was destroyed in the adventures in volume 2, and then so he decided to double down, to use the card terminology, doubles down, creates an even cooler shell, and that's shell number 5, and then that one gets destroyed too. So he sort of decides at the start of the book to sort of give it up. Of course, that's also all tied into the fact that he's kind of scared of dying, because he's realized, since he was almost killed over the course of volume 3, because he always, that really has shaken him to his core, because he always thought that while he was in the shell, he was invulnerable. So, as you'd expect from the man himself, Mr. Martin, some great stuff going on there thematically, sort of metaphorically. A lot of great character conflict. Always fun to read about the turtle, even though he is kind of he does really feel sorry for himself a lot, and sometimes it's a little, I guess we didn't have this phrase maybe in the 80s, but he's got a little bit of the white male privilege sort of aura about him. He is this beloved superhero, but all he can kind of do is whine about how his life should be better. Um, so a little bit sad at times, but still always a fun character to read about. The turtle story kind of begins early on in the book and then kind of is arguably the interstitial narrative, although I'm not sure if you could argue that any one story in here is the interstitial narrative. You could make the argument that it's actually the sleeper story that's the interstitial. But then again, Blood Ties, which is the Melinda Snodgrass Tachyon story, even though it starts only midway through, it almost kind of becomes the interstitial once it's there, starting there through to the end of the book. It's arguably the one that kind of ties everything together. So I'm not sure which one, if any of them, if you were to ask, say, George R. R. Martin or Melinda Snodgrass, which story is the interstitial in book 5, I don't know what they would tell you, but I guess they're the ones to ask because whatever they say would be the right one. The Michael Corleone story, or Rosemary Gambione, as she's called in these books, her conflict and her whole thing with Vagabond involves a somewhat unlikely, sort of unlikely scenario where she's both the DA, a New York City DA. I can't remember if she's like the district attorney or if she's one of several ADAs. She might actually be the head of the district attorney's office, but then she's also the head of the New York Mafia, the Gambione family, and somehow is able to do both. And she's sort of during this whole gang war that happens in book 5 between the Mafia and the Shadow Fists. There's this sort of this thread introduced about how when they manage to get their hands on people involved in the Mafia, she chooses not to prosecute. Whereas if anyone affiliated with the Shadow Fists gets caught, or anyone involved with the Shadow Fists runs afoul of the law, then she's quite willing and willing to use the DA office's resources to persecute them to the fullest. And so as this story starts, or as this book starts, people are starting to notice that. One of the people who notices is Paul Goldberg, I think is the character's name, who is Vagabond's love interest. So, and of course, Vagabond and Rosemary are meant to be good friends. There's a sort of odd, something odd in the Vagabond story, I always thought, where she's very loyal to this Rosemary character, more so than she's loyal to Jack, Sewer Jack, who's her good friend, going back to the 70s in Wildcard's continuity, so going back more than 10 years. So there's this whole notion of how of all her friends, she sort of is the most devoted to Rosemary, even though Rosemary's got some really dubious morality. I think the idea, if I were to put my interpretive spin on it, I think the idea is, since Vagabond is meant to have this sort of animalistic nature because she's telepathically connected to animals, and whether the idea is that that was kind of her natural predisposition is to be maybe more animal than human, or if it's just sort of the feedback loop from being constantly communicating with animals that has made her mind more animalistic. I guess that's probably more of an interpretive question. Although then again, Leanne C. Harper might have an answer to that question, about which one is actually the intent there. But so I think the idea is that she sort of imprints on people the way an animal might, and so and becomes sort of fiercely loyal specifically to that whoever she's imprinted upon, and Rosemary just happens to be the one, and so she sort of follows Rosemary kind of blindly for a good portion of the book, and then as Rosemary becomes more and more sort of immoral, at what point can Vagabond finally sort of break that bond? And that's I guess that's a pretty fair encapsulation of what's going on in that story. If I do say so myself, I guess. Jesus Was an Ace. Arthur Byron Cover, whom I am familiar with from a couple of Daredevil comics that he wrote in collaboration with Harlan Ellison, or possibly not in collaboration. Some people might know the issues I'm talking about. It's a two-parter in Daredevil number 208 and 209, I believe, or maybe 207 and 208. It might just be that Harlan Ellison had the idea and did a Marvel Method thing where he gave the plot to the artist David Mazzucchelli, um, and then Mazzucchelli uh, illustrated it, and then maybe Arthur Byron Cover just came in and did the dialogue. I'm not sure exactly how that fits together. That's a Daredevil two-parter published in 1984, I believe, or yeah, 1984, which would be that would be what, 3 years before this book is published, or 3 or 4 years before this book is published. And Arthur Byron Cover does a story. Also, there's a character in the story named Mazzucchelli, um, named after David Mazzucchelli. Maybe there's a little secret connection there. I'm not sure. But whatever the case, other than those two Daredevil comics and then this story, Jesus Was an Ace, I'm not too familiar with them. It's a really interesting story, though. It's a weird one because there's a lot going on in it, and then at the end, it doesn't quite it doesn't tie all the threads together. There's a lot of threads in there that in a saga like Wild Cards, you'd kind of just go, well, if threads have been left untied, it's because a future book is going to examine some of them. But I don't know that we ever really explore. But it's about Leo Barnett. I think I mentioned in the previous book who it was about. Leo Barnett and Quasi-Man. Yeah, I think I already talked about that in the other video. But there's like this whole thread about Gary Gilmore and what's the name of the Norman Mailer, the Executioner song, and the Gary Gilmore case, and Gary Gilmore is an ace in the Wild Cards universe, and I don't remember all the details exactly, but they talk about how he transformed people into pillars of salt, but his victim count is higher than the real Gary Gilmore's, which I thought was a striking detail that I'm not exactly sure the reason for, but I've never read Norman Mailer's Executioner song, so maybe I would get it if I actually read that book. Maybe I would understand that whole thread a little more. It doesn't really tie into anything or lead to anything. There's just this bit about how Gary Gilmore, before he was executed, Leo Barnett met him, and that's kind of it. And then it never gets mentioned again. Maybe they were going to do more with that, and then realized that there might be some legal issues with doing a fictional account of Gary Gilmore. I don't know. Some of these things occur to me as I'm talking, that maybe that's the reason they never came back to that whole Gilmore thing. But I feel like there's another thread too. Oh, there's a character named Dragonfly, I believe, who is introduced in the story, and is she sounds like a really cool character, and then spoilers, I guess, dies before the story's over. So it's like, oh, I guess we're never going to see more of her, unfortunately, which is kind of too bad because she kind of sounds kind of cool. Yeah, then the whole thing culminates with Leo Burnett announcing that he's going to run for president in '88. This story being set in '87, and it's really fascinating. And the whole Quasi-Man character, the way Arthur Byron Cover writes him, it really makes him seem like so fascinating, like sort of the way his mind works and the way his power works. I think other writers seem to have agreed, because Quasi-Man does get a lot of play, particularly in the Card Sharks trilogy, which is still several books away. But Quasi-Man becomes kind of a major player for a while, even though Arthur Byron Cover himself only contributes the one story and then never comes back for whatever reason. So, but yeah, the way he writes that character is really fascinating, and really even the way he writes Leo Barnett is really interesting. The character work is pretty compelling, I think. I'm just always kind of surprised because the story kind of has all these different threads. It's one of the sort of Shadow Fist Mafia confrontations, and then there's the whole Dragonfly character who's got this whole interesting backstory and kind of fascinating, kind of cool ace power as well. And turns out she's just kind of there to be cannon fodder. And even the ace or the Mafia Shadow Fist confrontation is just kind of a violent sort of confrontation that doesn't really, there's no real twist to it, I guess. which is not to say it's not an entertaining story. It just, when it starts, it seems like there's sort of more going on than when it ends. But like I say, the character work in that one is really cool. And then at that point, right around that point in the book is when the continuity catches up to the end of the previous book, the Aces Abroad World Tour. So at that point in the book, all the characters who had been out of town for the first 100 pages or so are back. And so you get the start of the Tachyon story, which becomes sort of another interstitial, like I said. Maybe Tachyon would be the interstitial story. Maybe that does deserve the designation the most, because he's definitely the one who sort of ties a lot of things together. It seems like, arguably, that's sort of the theme or the motif, the main motif of that story is Tachyon kind of spreading himself too thin. There's a good line, Melinda Snodgrass kind of lampshading the character in a way where he's talking about his grandson, who he discovered in the previous book that he had. Say, how old is he in this book? 10, a 10-year-old grandson. He must be 10 in this one, I think. Is that right? Or 11? Yeah, 12. He's got a 12-year-old grandson that he discovered in France, and he brings him back to America. And at one point, he says to one, Blaze is the character's name. He says to one of his nurses, "I need to find more time to spend with Blaze because he's the most important thing in my life." And the nurse says, "You know what your problem, Tachyon, is that everything is the most important thing in your life," which is a great line to use on anyone who maybe spreads themselves too thin and is worrying about too many things at once and needs to just calm down and focus on one thing at a time. Great line, one of my favorite lines from Snodgrass in this book. But yeah, the story kind of does jump around where Tachyon wants to do something about. He's trying to take care of his grandson. He wants to do something about the gang war because Jokertown is sort of getting. Jokertown is one of the major sort of arenas of combat. So one of the major what would you call it? So one of the major battlegrounds of the Shadow Fist Mafia War, and so he wants to do something about that. What else? What else? Oh, and then the Typhoid Croyd stuff. Once that stuff gets going, he tries to solve that issue as well. So he's sort of running around trying to, and then other threads come in too that he has to deal with, and so it's a little bit all over the place if you consider it as a story just on its own. Especially when you compare it to how tight the single stories that Snodgrass contributed to. How tight are those stories that Snodgrass contributed to Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 4? Those are really perfectly conceived and executed short stories that I really love. Whereas this one is in several parts and it kind of bounces around. So it does kind of make more sense if you consider it as an interstitial. So let's go with that. Let's call that one the book's main interstitial, even though it doesn't start until 150 pages in or so. I think that feels right. Where do we go from there? I mentioned last I literally discovered on camera that this book actually does give you the titles of the stories on the upper right, whereas the paperback, not a single edition of the paperback that I have does that. It just says Down and Dirty on both sides. So this is great. But now I can actually just page through and see real quickly where we are. So there we go. Jesus was an ace. Another part of All the King's Horses is the title of the turtle story. Concerto for Siren and Serotonin is the title of the sleeper story. Blood Ties is the title of the Tachyon story. This is all information you could probably find pretty easily online. But then again, maybe not. Now that I think about it, there's not really a lot of detailed Wildcards content online, which I guess is why I'm doing this. The Second Coming of Buddy Holly, which I think I mentioned before. A lot of these stories, even the ones that aren't broken up in terms of like scattered throughout the book, they still are sort of, even though this is like one long novella, it's still broken up into parts, which in this particular story is designated by days of the week. So it starts on a Wednesday. I believe it goes all the way through to the following Saturday. So there's about 10 or 11 chapters, whatever that ends up being. So a week and a half in the life of Sewer Jack by Edward Bryant, where he gets to meet Buddy Holly, who in real life died in 1960. I used to know it. In one of my tour essays, I laid this all out very in excruciating detail. The Buddy Holly plane crash, the day the music died. In the Wildcards universe, Buddy Holly, that plane crash just didn't happen. That whole plane trip, I think, didn't happen. Or maybe it did happen and they just landed safely. I don't remember. But I do remember that the upshot is that Buddy Holly is alive. I held that page right up to the camera. You might have seen that. Is it Buddy or Holly that's spelled differently? Something. It's a little bit of like fan minute. I assume Edward Bryant is a really big Buddy Holly fan. So he saves him, lets him live in the Wildcards universe. Live survives into the 80s, but his last name is spelled with an E because that actually is how it was spelled, but it got misspelled by a record company guy in the real world, and so he became Buddy Holly without the E. If you're a Buddy Holly fan, I guess it's kind of cool. It might be a little much. I don't know. If you're not a Buddy Holly fan, the second coming of Buddy Holly might be a little overboard. But it's got some interesting material. Sometimes it's fun to self-indulgence isn't always a bad thing. I would say. Who was it? I want to say it was Conan O'Brien who did an interview with the Onion AV Club, where he talked about how he doesn't understand why self-indulgence has a negative connotation, is considered a bad thing. He's like, that's what I want artists to be. I want artists to indulge themselves and create art that is really interesting to them, and that indulges their own interests and passions. In this case, Edward Bryant seems to be getting really self-indulgent when it comes to his fascination with Buddy Holly and creating sort of an alternate pop musical landscape of 1987, one in which, who is it? Is it T-Bone Burnett and Elvis Costello, instead of Elvis Costello being a popular solo act, he's part of a duo with T-Bone Burnett called the Something Brothers. It's not only in that tour essay, because Elvis Costello and T-Bone Burnett in the real world created one single under like an assumed, or under an alias. I want to say the Coward Brothers, but it sounds odd to me now. But the idea is that in the real world, they did it once for one little like novelty single, or created a fake name for their fake band for one track. But in the Wildcards universe, that's like their whole career, is that they were the Coward Brothers or whatever. Stuff like that. Certainly, I think, have I mentioned how old I was when I read these books? I guess I probably have. I was really young, like 13. I don't know if it was appropriate for me, with all the sex and violence and stuff. But maybe it was fine. I don't know. I guess I turned out fine. I'm kidding, of course. I'm a wreck, but I don't know that Wildcards is to blame. But then again, they might be. But anyway, certainly a lot of this stuff was lost on me when I was 13. Probably a lot of it would be lost on a lot of people now. I actually had to go online to figure out what was up with this Coward Brothers stuff and all this stuff. Figured out most of it. There's a reference to a band called Girls with Guns, if anyone knows what that's about. I'm guessing that it is an inside joke between Bryant and some friend of his, because I don't know what Girls with Guns is supposed to be, but maybe somebody does. If you do, comment on it. So obviously, different editions of these books are going to have different page counts based on the words per page. And in the case of the tour volume, some of them have new stories, which of course is going to change the word count even more, or change the page count and the word count even more. That's also the wrong way to say it. It's going to change the page count even more by changing the word count. But just to give you a sense of sort of what percentage of the book we've gotten through at this point. This edition is 470 pages. We're up to about 220 at this point. Um, and it's really not until right around here, right around the 220 mark or so, um, that the whole Typhoid Croyd storyline really starts to kick in, where Croyd is spreading this mutation of the wildcard virus, which is much less stable than the canonical sort of iteration of the wildcard virus, which once you're infected, once you become an ace or a joker, that's it. You can't be reinfected with the wild card. But the Croyd strain you can. So he starts to weave this sort of path of chaos because he himself doesn't know that he's a carrier. He doesn't know that he's doing it. So Croyd wakes up spreading this disease, and it's played as a mystery. So I guess I should apologize again for spoilers. But that said, I think it's a smoother read if you know going in that Croyd is doing this, because otherwise it seems very strange that halfway through the book, because the idea is that certain characters start to change, like so a Joker gets infected with the Black Queen and dies, Buddy Holly gets infected, becomes an ace, etc., etc. Other characters are exposed, but we get the idea that they've been exposed to the virus, but we don't actually know what happened to them, because that's fodder for later books, or seeds being planted for later books. So yes, it's a spoiler, but I think it's better if you know that going in, because it's the thing that Martin kind of laments in the afterword that he wrote to one of the editions, where he says, the publisher wanted us to add more story threads because they didn't think we had enough. So they had to so they came up with this Typhoid Croyd idea, but they have to, they have to establish a lot of stuff with the characters before they can have this character show up and start mutating them. And so it's a strange read in that sense, in that you're almost halfway through the book, and all of a sudden this new story thread just kind of pops in. Again, 13-year-old me, very confused. So then you get to Hue of a Mind by Stephen Lee. I feel so self-conscious every time I say Stephen Lee. You'll note he also breaks things up by date. It's about the same time span too. It goes from a Wednesday to I think a Saturday again. It's very similar, like another 10-day period. Curiously enough, when I was reading this book, I went through it recently to be very careful about temporal references to see when everything was taking place. Second Coming of Buddy Holly goes from Wednesday to Saturday. Then you read a couple of little shorter pieces of some of the broken up stories, and then you get to Hue of a Mind, which also goes Wednesday through Saturday. Turns out there's a little bit of overlap if you actually are tracking the chronology of all the characters. Like the second Wednesday in the Buddy Holly story is actually the same as the first Wednesday of Stephen Lee's story, even though they're separated quite a bit in the book, as if this is one 10-day period and then here's another 10-day period. Not so. As a matter of fact, there's like 4 days of overlap. Like the last 4 days of Buddy Holly are the same as the first 4 days of the Puppet Man story, Hue of a Mind. So there's a little bit of trivia for you that I'll bet even people who have read this book more than once may never have picked up on, because it's not really important, and there's really no reason to pick up on it, other than just being kind of obsessively detail-minded about chronology, which I do not say as a boast or anything like that, by the way. I say it to describe myself, but I'm not necessarily saying that it's any way to live your life. Don't do it, kids. Don't be like me. Hue of a Mind is it's sort of it's got some parallels to the Leo Barnett story, in that this one also, the Hue of a Mind also involves a character announcing that they're going to run for president. In this case, it's Greg Hartman, aka Puppet Man, who announces his candidacy. So that both of those are essentially planting seeds for Volume 6, which is all about the Democratic National Convention, the big battle between Greg Hartman and Leo Barnett, the political battle. Quite a bit of other stuff going on too, but certainly one of the story threads in Volume 6 is the the Hartman versus Barnett, those two campaigns. Um, Seed planted here. There's quite a few other seeds planted in Hue of a Mind, though. Hue of a Mind, it also picks up on where we left off with Puppet Man in Volume 4, where there were a lot of little threads going on, particularly in terms of people who were figuring out that Greg Hartman is not a gnat as he claims to be, that he's a secret ace, and different people getting closer to the truth over the course of that story. So Hue of a Mind, what's cool about that one is that it sort of gets all those characters in one place, whereas previously they were kind of in different vectors, because there's the Russian agent Polyakov, who sort of figured it out after the whole hostage situation in Berlin went south in Volume 4, because there was a Russian intelligence operative involved in that operation, who then reported to Polyakov. So now he has his suspicions about Greg Hartman. And then the sister of the Nur al-Allah, who was manipulated into cutting her brother's throat, has sort of realized she would never do that. She would never just cut her brother's throat if something wasn't controlling her. Sarah Morgenstern, of course, the reporter who is all over Volume 4, who sort of goes back and forth, believing Hartman is evil and then thinking maybe it was all in her head, and then thinking he's evil again, and back and forth. Gimli, the character from Volume 1 and Volume 4, a Joker who, I guess I didn't talk. Did I mention Gimli? Now I'm getting to the point where I don't remember if there's stuff that I just kind of thought about and almost talked about, or did I actually talk about it? But Gimli also was involved in that operation in Berlin, kidnapping Hartman, and he also had his sort of first clash and run-in with Hartman in 1976 in the story, in the Stephen Lee Puppet Man story in the very first book. So Gimli has his suspicions, or more than suspicions, I suppose. He really just genuinely believes what is in fact true, which is that Hartman is the sort of evil ace. And then there's also Digger Downs, who's, I want to say, is he introduced in Volume 4? I know there's been so many retcons that have put Digger Downs earlier into the continuity, but maybe Volume 4 is, or is he in Volume 3? I can't remember. But he's a reporter for the magazine Aces, and then we learn eventually that he's another secret ace, actually, who his power is basically to detect other wild cards. By scent, to him they give off a certain odor that people who aren't infected don't give off. So he, as soon as he meets Hartman at the beginning of Volume 4, he realizes that Hartman's an ace. And then it's a subtle thread going through Volume 4, because he's on the world tour, and so is Chrysalis, who's sort of like the information broker of Jokertown. I've talked about her before, of course, because I think she's a super cool character, and so does Melinda Snodgrass. That she's the one who Snodgrass has said she definitely wants to be in the TV show, if and when they make a TV show. But an information broker in Jokertown, and so Digger Downs figures that she's a good person to maybe link with, because he's got this kind of secret information that clearly only he has, or he thinks that only he has. So who is the best to help him exploit it? And he sort of goes to Chrysalis. But it's very, very low level, low key, one of those things that it's hard to remember now how obvious it was back when I first read the books. Because now I've reread them enough times where now it's like, oh yeah, I know where this is going. But it's hard to remember where my mind was at. Sometimes the first time you read these books, there's just so much going on. Easy to miss threads, even threads that seem really obvious in retrospect. Sometimes it's because it's really subtle. Sometimes it's not even so much that it's subtle. It's just that there's so much other stuff going on at the same time in the narratives, that you just can't possibly expect to hold on to each thing. So it's a very subtle thing, the Digger Downs Chrysalis alliance in Volume 4. Maybe not even the alliance itself, but the reason for it. Or maybe it's not. Like I say, I've read it so many times, and now as soon as it happens, I'm like, oh, yeah, Chrysalis and Digger, I get it. But anyway, so quite a few characters, when you lay it all out at this point in the narrative, there's quite a few characters who are starting to suspect that Hartman is more than what he seems, or has secrets, um, all at different levels. All at different levels of knowledge or completeness of their knowledge. The Nur al Allah's sister, Kahina, uh, really believes that there's something truly sinister and evil about him. Whereas, like Digger and Chrysalis, for example, they just know he's an ace, that he's hiding a secret wild card, but they have no idea what it is. They might have some idea what he's capable of, but they don't know that he's actually evil. They just know he has a secret. So Stephen Lee sort of gets all those characters into one place in Hue of a Mind, uh, and it's pretty purely from the point of view of logistics. It's very shrewd in that way, putting them all into one story and sort of seeing how Puppet Man, aka Greg Hartman, deals with it. And sort of uses both his powers and his connections and his assets, if you will, to sort of deal with these various threats, these sort of threats to the security of his secret, or however you want to phrase that. So yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one, and it plants a lot of seeds for the one of my favorite books in the series, which is Volume 7, Dead Man's Hand, which is sort of this great kind of noir murder mystery sort of setup. Really a cool book in the series, unique in the sense that there aren't many books in the series. Maybe I guess you could probably argue Volume 7 is the only one that kind of is this sort of noir, has this noir feel. Well, that's not the only murder mystery, I guess. When I say that, there are a couple books that revolve around a murder mystery. And I have to say, I always like when they do that. It's a great hook. Obviously, it's classic. But Volume 7 involves the murder of I don't know if it's a spoiler to say now. It probably isn't really, because she dies right at the start of the next book. So I'll just say, I won't say who the murderer is, but Chrysalis is the one who's killed. She's killed at the start of book 6, but we don't really deal with the mystery of it all until Volume 7. But it's another of those things that Volume 5, especially when you go back and reread Volume 5, there's a lot of little things, particularly in Hue of a Mind. There are a lot of little seeds planted, some of which are actually red herrings, are things that make you supposed to, maybe are there to make you say, oh, I know who must have killed Chrysalis, because there's that whole bit. I can't remember now. There's some bit in one story about how there's a character who is attracted to Chrysalis and she's not interested in him, and he becomes a suspect in Volume 7. That's just one offhand example. But Hue of a Mind actually seeds a bunch of things. And it's another example where I sort of wonder, like, how well I would have done. I mean, I was only 13, so I probably wouldn't have done well at all. But how well would I have done about tracking all the different plot threads? But I probably wouldn't have. If I read the books in order, which I didn't. I read Volume 7 first, and then read Volume 5 later. So almost a better way. It's one of those series where spoilers can almost help, because you know where they're going, and so you can actually go back and see, oh, they're planting that seed there and that seed there. Hue of a Mind by Stephen Lee, or Lay, is one of those stories, I think, where there's so much going on that you don't even realize all of it on first read, just how many seeds he's planting. While still making it a good story anyway. The Puppet Man stories all have that same energy of almost, I've said it before, but they almost feel like they're leaning into, I shouldn't say almost feels like, they just do lean more into sort of horror elements of suspense and horror, rather than what a lot of the other writers in the book do, where it's really more leaning into action adventure, or sci-fi, science fictional elements, or even fantasy elements, arguably, with some of the Takesian stuff. But every so often, some of the writers will lean into more of a lean more into the direction of horror, and certainly Puppet Man, the Stephen Lee Puppet Man stuff is in that vein. In the same way that kind of mirroring what I said about the opening story, the Yeoman story, that how it's in many ways the best Yeoman story, the single Yeoman story for me. Hue of a Mind. I don't know if I'd call it the best Puppet Man story, or the most quintessential Puppet Man story. But there is something about I think just that the fact that it's the one where so many of his rivals that have been assembled, mostly through Volume 4, but also in the first book too, um, where they're all sort of arrayed against him, where it really seems like, oh, Greg Hartman could lose it all right here. He's made so many enemies already, and they're all in one story, and then the way he just kind of pew 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 kind of knocks them all down, it really goes a long way towards making it seem like, oh man, this guy's unstoppable. Like he's gonna become president and be the most evil, most powerful evil human around. Really, I think ups the stakes on the astronomer, who's the big bad of the previous triad. Hartman is just they really up the stakes in terms of depravity and just how unbeatable he seems. Um, Despite the fact that technically if you were to go if you were going like the RPG campaign power levels route and look at all by the numbers, the astronomer is like way more heavy duty, more powerful. But there's just something more sort of, I don't know, horrible and scary about Hartman, and more insidious. Um, so yeah, great character, great villain, probably the ultimate wildcards villain, and the story in this book does get a lot of like the sort of the classic Puppet Man tropes, or the quintessential Puppet Man tropes, all in one story, um, which makes it a plus, makes it a thumbs up, I suppose. Addicted to Love is the second Pat Cadigan Water Lily story, the first one having shown up in Volume 2. It's also the story that ticks along another plot thread with T. Melise, or as my friend John and I used to call him, Ty Malice. I think I told that story already. That it wasn't until I saw it pronounced in a virtual Wildcards panel online that Walter John Williams started talking about T. Melise, and I was baffled. Like, I thought I read these books a million times and knew every character. Who the hell is T. Melise? Oh, Ty Malice. Oh, we pronounced so many of these characters wrong, which I probably am still doing. I apologize, Stephen Lai, if you're actually named Stephen Lee, or I apologize, Stephen Lee, if I've been calling you Stephen Lay. Addicted to Love by Pat Cadigan. It's Water Lily, and then it's Water Lily basically versus T. Melise, who is introduced very early on in Volume 4, and then is another of those subtle presences throughout the rest of Volume 4. And then, of course, we get no closure whatsoever. Like, what's going on with T. Melise? And then this is the story where you find out that he's another evil presence that's now made it to New York City, kind of sort of a... Well, I think I've said this before, probably, that he's sort of like it's like he's an alter ego of Puppet Man, or a sort of more literal manifestation of Puppet Man, who, as the name implies, kind of sort of takes people as puppets, but sort of in this sort of long distance, kind of telepathic, subtle manipulation way, but still a puppet master. But then you have T. Melise, who is literally like clamping himself onto a human being, and suddenly that human being has no autonomy and is essentially just a puppet of the thing on their back. So essentially another Puppet Man, and there's a sort of running, I guess. Well, I was going to say it's never explicit, but it is in Volume 7. I think they kind of make it somewhat explicit that there's sort of there's this period in the Wildcards timeline where two puppet masters are sort of operating in parallel. Once we get through the T. Melise story, then it's sort of, what are we up to now? So Water Lily, I guess if you're wondering what happens in that story, basically Water Lily becomes one of the mounts of T. Melise. And at that point, we're now at page 335 out of 470. So now we're in sort of the marathon, the last leg of the marathon, I would say, where a lot of the things that have been set up earlier in the book now start to pay off. Everything's set up, and now it's time to knock them down. So we get we get the ending of the Vagabond and Rosemary bit, and then Tachyon finally figures out that at this point in the story, they know that there's a contagious form of wildcard, and finally Tachyon figures out that it's a person, like the what he calls a human vector, in that because he's been trying to find like this to try and triangulate the source, and eventually realizes that the source must be mobile, which means it must be a person, and then they figure out that it's the sleeper. Meanwhile, the sleeper is just getting increasingly further into his waking cycle, and the premise with the sleeper from the start is that the further he gets into his waking cycle, the more paranoid he becomes, because he's taking drugs to keep himself awake, drugs which cause paranoia as one of their symptoms. So he's getting more paranoid, and it becomes sort of an illustration of that sort of classic Saw. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not all out to get you. In this case, for once, the sleeper is actually right in his paranoia, because once Tachyon figures out that he's the human vector, then it becomes paramount to capture this guy. So they really are after him. It becomes a very entertaining sort of feedback loop as his paranoia increases because it's actually justified. We get the payoff to the turtle story, which hard to describe without being too spoilery. As I mentioned before, a big part of the storyline right at the start is that he's decided to quit being the turtle. He's not going to sink his money into these turtle shells anymore. And so he decides he's going to sell the three remaining shells, the three that weren't destroyed, his first three. He's going to sell them, make a bunch of money that way, and then he's also going to sell the junkyard, make some money that way, and just kind of stop being a loser in his Tom Tudbury life. And so and he's given up on heroism, and that leads to seems like a very safe sort of trajectory, but in classic George R.R. Martin style, I guess, finds a way for Tom Tudbury's attempt to play it safe becomes very dangerous, because he sort of gets caught out in the streets during martial law. Only now he's without his shell. And so we get to see him sort of what can Tom Tudbury do when he's not protected by his shell. And it's great. It's so cool. I don't want to get into too many details, because it's one of those stories where there's just so many like surprising moments, just kind of one after the other. Super cool. So I'll leave it at that. That jumps straight into another awesome part of this book, Mortality by Walter John Williams, which is the second Modular Man story. It's so weird when you're on camera to forget the things that should be on the tip of your tongue. But Modular Man, doing the things that a modular can. One of the awesome characters who first debuted in Volume 2, and then this is another thing I learned from that same virtual panel. Walter John Williams. So the trajectory of Modular Man is that he's this pretty awesome badass android invented by a guy whose ace power is basically he gets the power to make an android. Is basically this guy's ace power, Dr. Travnicek, if I'm saying that one right. And so he's awesome, Modular Man. Everything about him is cool. He's like this total badass character. And then in Volume 3, he gets blown up by the astronomer, and then in Volume 5, he's rebuilt by his creator. And then the story is called Mortality because it's sort of Modular Man having to deal with the fact that he could get destroyed and not be rebuilt, essentially. And sort of he sort of goes into this sort of not quite existential crisis. I don't think that's the right word. Oh, well, actually, maybe it is existential crisis. It's some sort of crisis. Just the crisis of dealing with your own mortality, of really kind of facing it. Um, so now, me thinking of, reading these books and sort of thinking like I don't know, going back into your like college literary analysis days, you think, oh, this is what Walter John Williams always intended. This was always the arc he intended for the character. Um, so he probably, even though he didn't contribute any writing to Volume 3, um, Louis Shiner writes this scene where Modular Man dies. So you think, oh, Walter John Williams must have told him, hey, do me a favor, blow up Modular Man because I want to do this arc about him facing his mortality and everything. Surely that makes the most sense. I never would have even doubted that that was the case. I just assumed that as a reader. And then Walter John Williams in this virtual conference is like, yeah, so because they have to vet any scene that their characters are in. So like any Modular Man scene, any scene that has Modular Man in it has to be vetted by Walter John Williams. And so Louis Shiner just blows up Modular Man just for the hell of it, apparently. I mean, it serves the story, of course, but he blows up Modular Man and then faxes the pages to Walter John Williams and says, hey, is this okay, Walter? I blew up your guy. And and Walter John Williams says, yeah, I guess that's fine. I mean, the inventor can build another one. So sure. So not only was it not Williams' idea, but it wasn't even, Louis Shiner didn't even ask him first. He didn't say, hey, I'm about to write this scene and I was thinking it would be cool to blow up Modular Man. Is that okay? No, he writes the scene. He just kills the character and then asks permission after the fact. Wow. That really blew my mind. It sort of changed sort of my whole perception of how these books are written, that there really is much more. There's actually a similar story where Martin talks about, or maybe it's Snodgrass who tells the story. It must be Snodgrass, where she did a story about Jay Aykroyd, which is a character, or did a book where Jay Aykroyd was one of the main characters and decided to have him fall in love and get married over the course of the book. And it's a character created by George R. R. Martin. And same deal, where I would have just assumed, oh, Martin must have thought it might be cool to have this character get married. So he sort of said, hey, Melinda, as long as you're writing Jay Aykroyd, I have this idea that maybe it's time for him to settle down. So why don't you include that? But again, no, that's not how it works. Melinda Snodgrass just writes the book, faxes it to George. So she faxes over these pages. And she said that he called her on the phone. If I'm getting the story right, he called her on the phone and without any preamble was like, you gave me a wife? So it's wild to think about that. Like, that you do, I guess because some of the writers have sort of compared it to that. Is David Levine is one of the writers who said that it's the closest he'll ever get to being in like a television writer's room, because it's a whole pool of writers all writing these characters. So a character you create could be in the hands of someone else, or you might decide the fate of a character created by someone else. But of course, that creates a certain image in your mind of a writer's room. So before any of these books is ventured upon, they all get together. And Walter John Williams did say that they would have like little conferences. They would all get together, but it sounds like they were pretty casual. But they would have story conferences and talk about what they wanted to do next. One thing I'd love to ask the writers, if I can ever, have I said this yet? If I haven't said it yet, I'm going to put it out there now, put it out into the universe. I'd love to do some Zoom chats with writers of Wildcards. So if anyone's willing to be the first to do like a Zoom chat for this YouTube channel, and I'll just bug you with the most annoying fanboy questions that you've ever gotten where Wildcards is concerned. Or maybe not. I don't know what conventions are like. Maybe you've gotten more annoying questions. But I feel like I could probably be in your top 5 of most annoying fans. But that's what I'm going to shoot for. But anyway, so I'm putting that out there now. But one of the questions I'd love to ask a lot of the, or at least even one of the writers, but I'd love to get takes on this, is like where do the initial ideas come from now? A book like I'm just reading volumes. I just got I reread volume 22, and I'm in the middle of 23, which those two books are all about this sort of fight club um, in Kazakhstan, which then ties into this character who uh, sort of his ace power put him in contact with this horrible presence from a different dimension. Um, uh, and you go, okay, where did this all come from? And then in the back of the book, there's like credits, like who created the characters that appear in the book, which I love those credits, by the way. They're so illustrative and educational. Ty Frank, one of the co-authors of The Expanse, the very successful book and also TV series. Ty Frank is credited as the guy who created Horror Show, which is the Horror Show and Hellraiser, which is the ace in this villainous demon presence. But Ty Frank doesn't contribute any prose to volume 22 or 23. So it's like, okay, did he come up with the whole Fight Club thing and that idea, and they just ran with it? And how did he pitch that idea? Like, because there's lots of documentation from authors about how they pitch characters, but not as much about how ideas are pitched, like the premise of a book or the premise of a whole trilogy or whatever. Do those all just come from Martin and Snodgrass, or do authors pitch those too, or how does that work? I've always been curious about that, but I digress. The point is that I assume that there's these conferences, and then Walter John Williams says, "Oh, yeah, if you could kill Modular Man in book 3, that would be great, because then I can do my Modular Man deals with mortality story when he gets rebuilt." And instead, it's the opposite. Lou Shiner just destroys Modular Man apparently on a whim, and Williams, and then after the fact asks permission after he's kind of already written the scene, and then Williams says, "Oh yeah, I can make some hay with that," which is awesome. Mind blowing to me, but super cool, because mortality. So that's how we get mortality, which is the Modular Man story in Volume 5, which is chef's kiss, absolutely fantastic. One of the best stories in the book, probably my favorite story in the book. Well, that's always a bold claim to make off the top of your head, but without thinking about it too much and just kind of doing like just a quick mental recount of which stories are in Volume 5, I'd say Mortality is probably my favorite. And so it's another one that I don't want to spoil too much, because it's just so cool. But it's another great. The Modular Man stories are always like great, just in the sense of being like cool superhero action rendered in prose. Like there's a real thrill to the Modular Man stories, because it's kind of it goes kind of straight to that one of the core appeal of the superhero genre, which is what Wildcards is messing with and doing their take on. Obviously, is the superhero genre at the heart of it. And sometimes it's just cool to see a guy with a lot of kick-ass superpowers kicking ass and just being awesome, which is what always happens in a Modular Man story. But Mortality in particular, really all the Modular Man stories do a great job with the characterization of this android character. But Mortality, to me, really gets to the core and really makes him relatable in a really clever and poignant way. So that it's not just about the kick-ass action parts, even though those parts are also beautifully written and well done. And the whole thing just what's the word? It coheres very, very nicely. Really a high point of the book, real highlight of the book and the series, I think. So yeah, really, really good. And it kind of it kind of acts as well. There are multiple climaxes in a book like this where different stories are always, because of the fact that a lot of the stories have been cut into pieces. So when you get to the final piece or the climactic piece, so you get the climax of the turtle story, and then you get the Modular Man story, which is almost all climax in a way, and then you get the tachyon climax and the sleeper climax, etc., etc. But yeah, Mortality leads straight into the final part of the Tachyon saga, Tachyon story, the Tachyon story in Volume 5, which is which resolves everything. Resolves the typhoid Croyd bit, resolves the gang war. well, I guess those two things. Those are the two big resolutions because the Greg Hartman thread is left open to be dealt with in the next book, and the Team Elise thread is left open to be dealt with in Volume 7. So those are left open, but the gang war gets some really solid resolution, and so does the typhoid story, all in that final Tachyon story. And then from there, it's really just kind of a series of epilogues, which really in books like these, the epilogues are sort of anything but boring, in my opinion. It's just sort of I guess maybe a byproduct of the structure of these books, where by that point you're invested in not just one story thread and not just one character or even two, but like half a dozen different characters and half a dozen different threads. So when you get like, three or four epilogues, which is kind of what you get, I guess, because there's the Zelazny, there's an epilogue to, there are four epilogues, I guess. Hey, there's Zelazny's epilogue to The Sleeper. There's Leanne C. Harper's epilogue to the Rosemary stuff. John Joseph Miller comes back kind of to bookend the story with a little epilogue to his Yeoman story at the start, and then George R. Martin kind of tops things off with an epilogue to the Turtle story, and even the epilogues are good. In a Wild Cards book, even the epilogues are fun. There's not too much to say. I don't know if it's worth. I guess it's not really worth getting into the epilogues that much, because that really would be a spoiler. You can wait until later books to talk about how things ended up at the end of book 5. So highly recommended. I mean, I guess I'm just recommending the whole series, so there's not much. You kind of got to read them all. Well, you don't have to. No. All right. Let's just say I'm conflicted on that point. I think it's worth reading them all from the beginning, because you get so much. There's just so much cool stuff that happens, and there's so many clever things that develop over time. That a real joy of the series is seeing these different threads as characters mutate. Some characters get closure while new characters come to the fore. Background characters become sorry for my huge hand there. Background characters come forward to become main characters. Main protagonists whose maybe their arc is completed, but they're still around, they're still alive. So even though we've gotten their story, that doesn't mean they stop existing. So they kind of, sometimes it's the opposite, that a lead character suddenly becomes a supporting character, while supporting characters become leads, and new characters are introduced and old characters are written out. And a big part of the appeal really is seeing that happen over time. For old timers like me, almost happening in real time, because now I've been reading this series for 30 years, 30 books in 30 years. Wow. Once again, I digress. My point was just to say that I recommend this book, which I guess is silly because I'm recommending all of them. But I do think it's good. Like I said before, George R. R. Martin in that one afterword says that he finds the book a little bit structurally odd, because of the way they were sort of forced to shoehorn in the typhoid Croyd stuff. From an Aristotelian standpoint, yeah, it's a little weird that you didn't. It took such a long time to start the typhoid Croyd stuff. You're almost halfway through the book before that becomes a thing. That is a little odd. But sometimes the weird things in a book are what really make it distinctive and interesting. And so I can sort of see where, from the perspective of Martin, when he first put this book out, he and the authors, it's the 5th book of 5, so of course you want every single one to be kind of immaculate. Now it's the 5th book of 29, as at the time of writing. So at this point, have a book here and there where the structure is very strange, and so now book 5 kind of stands out in the mind and in the memory of a Wild Cards fan, I think, because it is kind of strange and structured a little oddly. It sort of becomes a feature, a feature, not a bug, as the saying goes. I don't think that's being an apologist for the book. I genuinely do think it sort of, in the broader context of the series, it becomes sort of just an interesting feature of the volume. because there's really no other book that's quite weighted in that way of like we're introducing one storyline and then 200 pages in, here's another storyline, and then they'll both kind of resolve at the same time. It's just really unusual, and I think ultimately that becomes a plus because it makes the book more memorable. So yeah, I like it. It's also a book, to use a Chris Claremontism. We'll eventually get to Chris Claremont's actual contributions to Wild Cards. That hasn't happened quite yet, although I think even as early as this he was a fan because he was dropping little references to Wild Cards into issues of X-Men by this time. By the time this book came out, that was definitely happening. Claremont loves to use that phrase, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So this is a book where I think that really holds true, where the mix, the sequence is very good. The mix, the way the stories are sequenced, you could probably pick apart a lot of the individual stories in this book, and sort of go, oh, maybe this should have been tighter, this should have been shorter, or whatever. You could certainly pull it apart in that way, and Martin does say that he feels that there's some problems with this one, but it holds together very well, and sort of the way the different stories kind of butt up against each other, that almost sounds negative. I don't mean that negatively, but sometimes like the tone and the pace established by one author, and then a totally different tone and pace established by another author, and both of them would have their merits and their strengths and their weaknesses maybe individually, but they really work nicely when they kind of interlock, or even when they're just juxtaposed and sort of set right next to each other. I think Volume 5 does benefit. You could argue that's just generally speaking part of the appeal of Wild Cards, but I think in Volume 5 I feel like it's particularly noticeable how if you were to pull one story out, you might say, oh, kind of an interesting story, some interesting things going on, some good prose. But you wouldn't necessarily be knocked out by it. But when all of the ingredients are kind of baked into this book, you kind of get to the end, and at least for me, I sort of think, oh, that was a really satisfying read. Like everything really works nicely together. And then there are some really cool things that do stand out as brilliant, like Mortality by Walter John Williams, and the Turtle Story by Martin, which are just two true just classics, no matter what context. Yeah, as always, I have lots of good things to say about these books. I guess that is the point. I never know how to end because obviously I'm always focusing on the positive, and so it's always going to be like, another great book. I have to work on my endings to these things, I guess. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. As always, do the whole like, follow, subscribe bit if that's your jam. Tell your friends. Wild Cards authors, if you're watching, please hit me up about maybe doing some interviews. That would be a lot of fun for me. It'll be fun for you too, I think. Thanks again, as always. Love you. Until next time.
Have any class? She says, "Hon, what is it?" "I'm trying to visit with my pal Melinda Snodgrass. Shoot the breeze with Walter John Williams. Hang out with Howard Waldrop. I've been smarting for George R.R. Martin. His characters have so much pop. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. My heart's broken several places. Baby's just sitting there reading about aces."